Right. So whilst Keir Starmer has been busy touring the country pretending everything's absolutely tickety-boo and Rachel Reeves has been insisting her economic policies are working brilliantly, the actual numbers have come out and they tell a rather different story. Britain's economy contracted by 0.1% during October, marking the third consecutive month without any growth whatsoever. 3 months. That is not a blip, that is a trend. And it is a trend pointing in precisely the wrong direction. And Reform UK's policy chief, Zia Yusuf, has absolutely let rip with what can only be described as a verbal demolition of Labour's economic competence, calling the cabinet a bunch of incompetents whose handling of the economy has been nothing short of disastrous. When someone with actual private sector experience looks at what this government's doing and calls it incompetent, you probably want to pay attention. Quick favour. If you are enjoying watching Labour's economic policies implode whilst Reform delivers the brutal truth, hit that subscribe button and smash the notifications bell. Over 94% of viewers haven't yet. It is free, takes 1 second, and keeps us bringing you all the political fireworks. Cheers if you did. Now, back to this economic carnage. So let us start with the numbers. Because whilst they might sound abstract and boring to some people, they actually tell an absolutely devastating story. The Office for National Statistics confirmed this morning that Britain's economy contracted by 0.1% during October. That follows September's identical 0.1% decline and flat performance in August. So we have had 3 straight months without expansion, which means the economy is essentially treading water at best, or more accurately, slowly sinking. This is not the kind of economic performance you want when you have just won a general election promising to deliver growth and prosperity for all. Zia Yusuf, speaking to GB News, absolutely did not hold back when delivering his verdict on these figures. He said it has been framed as a surprise, but it really is not a surprise if you observe how this Labour government has been running the economy. They are, and I quote, a bunch of incompetents who in the entire cabinet, no one has any experience of creating value in the economy, growing an economy, and making decisions in the private sector. Now, that is not just a casual criticism. That is a direct accusation that nobody in the government actually understands how the economy works because none of them have ever worked in the real world where you have to create value, manage resources, and actually turn a profit. And you know what? He has got an absolutely valid point there. When you look at Labour's cabinet, it is stuffed full of career politicians, advisors, union officials, and people who have spent their entire adult lives in the public sector political bubble. There is basically nobody there who has started a business, grown a company, met a payroll, dealt with customers, navigated regulations, competed in markets, or done any of the things that actually create economic growth. It is like putting together a football team entirely of people who have never kicked a ball, and then wondering why they keep losing matches. You would not let someone who had never cooked before run a restaurant, so why would you let people with zero private sector experience run the entire British economy? Yusuf continued his absolutely savage assessment by pointing out that Labour is basically continuing what the Conservatives did for 14 years. Endless deficits, lots of borrowing, debt going up, endless increases in the size of the state and state spending, and then a big deficit that they call a black hole. And how do you fund that black hole? You raise taxes on the people watching this program, the contributors and the grafters who are then disincentivized from bothering to work hard in the first place. It is a doomed loop where governments spend money they do not have, create deficits they cannot fund, and then hit taxpayers with ever higher bills to try to plug the gap, which suppresses economic activity and makes the whole problem worse. Now, here is where Yusuf's analysis gets really interesting, because he digs into the details of that seemingly small 0.1% contraction. He points out that we have only had growth in the economy in one of the last 7 months in this country. 1 month out of 7. That is an absolutely abysmal track record. Meanwhile, the population explosion continues with hundreds of thousands in net immigration, which means GDP per capita, which he correctly identifies as the only statistic that actually matters, is continuing to decline. In other words, each individual person in the country is actually getting poorer, even if the overall economy manages to stumble forward occasionally. This is a critical point that politicians love to ignore. They will trumpet overall GDP growth whilst completely glossing over the fact that if the population is growing faster than the economy, everyone is getting poorer on average. It is like bragging that your household income went up by 5% whilst conveniently forgetting to mention that your family size doubled. You are not actually better off, You are worse off, but the raw numbers let you pretend otherwise. Yusuf then turned his attention to the political instability that is plaguing Britain's economy. He pointed out that most people in the business world think Rachel Reeves has already delivered her last budget. Let that sink in for a moment. She has been Chancellor for less than a year, delivered 2 budgets, and people already think she is finished. That is not just a vote of no confidence. That is a complete collapse of credibility. He acknowledged that the Conservatives had 3 chancellors in 3.5 months and 6 prime ministers in 8 years, which was absolute chaos, but suggested there is even more instability now with Keir Starmer, or at least just as much. And this matters enormously because if you are an international capital allocator deciding where to invest billions of pounds, or even a business here in the UK trying to make long-term investment decisions, you are going to hold back when there is massive political instability. Why would you commit to building a factory or starting a major project when you have no idea what the tax regime or regulatory environment will look like in 6 months? That uncertainty kills investment, which kills job creation, which kills economic growth. It is yet another doom loop that this government seemed completely incapable of escaping. Then Yusuf delivered what might be the most devastating criticism of all. He pointed out that Rachel Reeves appears to be absolutely flabbergasted that she has made employing people more expensive by increasing national insurance contributions by 2% and making it riskier by bringing in what Reform terms the unemployment rates bill, and seems shocked that businesses are going to employ fewer people. This is genuinely mind-boggling stuff. The Chancellor has made employment more expensive and riskier, and then acts surprised when businesses respond by employing fewer people. It is like setting fire to a building and then expressing shock when it burns down. We have unemployment in this country at multi-year highs, youth unemployment growing at the fastest rate in the G7, and the government is actively making it harder and more expensive for businesses to hire people. This is not economics. This is economic self-harm. Any first-year economics student could tell you that if you tax something, you get less of it. If you tax employment through higher national insurance contributions, you get less employment. This is not complicated. Yet somehow the Chancellor and her team of advisors managed to miss this blindingly obvious fact. Yusuf's verdict on the whole situation? It is a disaster. The entire thing is a complete and utter disaster, and the only way Britain escapes this doom loop is to do the opposite of what has been happening. That means reducing state spending and allowing contributors, people who actually go to work and create value, to keep more of their wages. In other words, smaller government, lower taxes, and more freedom for businesses and individuals to prosper. It is a fundamentally different economic philosophy from the high-tax, high-spend approach that both Labour and the Conservatives have been pursuing for years. When asked by host Miriam Cates what reform would do differently, Yusuf laid out a clear vision. First, a total legislative reset. He described the current situation where anyone who can put a spanner in the works gets to stop the whole production line for anything, whether it is a nuclear power plant and somebody concerned about fish wanting to spend £250,000 per fish on that project, or home building. It is the same story everywhere. Britain has created a system where obstruction is easy and progress is nearly impossible, and that has to change if the economy is going to grow. Second, changing how quangos work. These quasi-autonomous non-governmental organizations are, in his words, totally unaccountable to ministers and the people who voters put into office to make decisions. You cannot have situations where unelected bureaucrats at DEFRA, unaccountable to the electorate, can stop major projects from happening. Yes, of course we want to protect the environment, but ultimately those decisions need to be made by elected politicians who are accountable to voters, not by unaccountable bureaucrats who answer to nobody. This is actually a really important point that does not get discussed enough. Britain has created this sprawling network of quangos and regulatory bodies that have enormous power to block things, but zero accountability to the public. They can stop major infrastructure projects, housing developments, energy generation, and all sorts of economically vital activities, and there is basically nothing anyone can do about it. Ministers cannot override them, Parliament cannot control them, voters cannot remove them. It is governance without accountability, and it is strangling Britain's economic potential. The contrast between Yusuf's clear, practical vision for economic reform and Labour's muddled, contradictory approach could not be starker. He has diagnosed the problems, identified the root causes, and proposed specific solutions. Meanwhile, Rachel Reeves is raising taxes whilst claiming to support growth, increasing regulatory burdens whilst claiming to support business, and making employment more expensive whilst claiming to support job creation. It is incoherent policymaking driven by people who fundamentally do not understand how economies actually work. What makes this particularly frustrating is that the solutions are not complicated. You want economic growth? Make it easier to build things. Reduce the regulatory burden on businesses. Lower taxes so people have more money to spend and invest. Create stable, predictable policies so businesses can plan long-term investments. Stop making employment more expensive if you want businesses to hire more people. These are not revolutionary ideas. They are basic economic common sense that has been proven to work in countries around the world. Instead, we get a government that does the opposite of all these things and then acts surprised when the economy contracts. It is like watching someone repeatedly hit themselves in the face with a hammer and then wonder why they have got a headache.